right. Let's automate all the things. I'm so excited for so many reasons. I'm excited because webhooks are my favorite kind of topic, and incoming webhooks is such a huge unlock for Airtable that just allow you to do so much. So what I want to cover today is we're going to start off with just what is a webhook, how does it work, do a very simple integration where Stripe is going to send us webhooks, and we're going to, when we create new invoices, so we can track those in Airtable and then kind of track the updating of that status. Now, it's okay if your goal is not to integrate Stripe with Airtable. Where I want to start is actually like webhooks is super powerful because it lets you integrate anything. So what a webhook is essentially is kind of like a phone number for your Airtable base that any other service out there can call and say like, oh, we've got like something happened, right? So something like we got a new MailChimp person signed up to your newsletter, or someone signed up in Memberstack, or you've got a new invoice update. And so what's really exciting about webhooks is that you can pretty much do anything, right? And I know it's kind of like boring to say that you can do anything, but you really can. So today, what I hope you take away from today's Automate All the Things is not like, oh, this is how I sync Stripe with Airtable, but what I hope you take away is like, oh, like, does this service have webhooks? And if it does, you feel comfortable integrating it into Airtable. So what I'm thinking of covering is this right here. So first, we're gonna how to sync new Stripe invoices into Airtable, how to track updates to those Stripe invoices, and third, if we have time, going from a new sign up on a Memberstack into Airtable, and then depending on what subscription or option that person decided, sending them over to your newsletter via API. Now, I don't think we'll have time for all three of those. Let me know in the chat if you're a Stripe user, if you've heard of Stripe, and like if there's another service, right? Maybe it's MailChimp, Slack, Twitter, I don't know. Let me know in the chat what service you would like to integrate with Airtable where there's no native sync or there's no native automation trigger. And I'll try to kind of see whether it's possible and cover it at the end if we have time. So with that, let's kind of jump into first webhooks in Airtable, and then we're going to go to Stripe, understand how webhooks work, and then going to go back into Airtable of how do we actually integrate the webhook. So Carrie, I'm with you. I always felt like webhooks were like the most intimidating thing ever. But once you start using them, they're actually quite easy to, I don't know if easy is the right word, but much less intimidating than I think they should be. Especially that Airtable, does a lot of that work for you. So it's mainly a question of configuration and then figuring out edge cases. But that's enough kind of like theory. Let's kind of dig in here. So first, let me jump into Airtable automations and go ahead and create a custom automation and talk to you about why you would use a webhook, right? So let me say, just Stripe invoice. I know that's where we're going, but then, if I wanted to say when a new invoice in Stripe is created, I'd like that information to be reflected in my Stripe invoices table. I did some testing before. Let me actually start from scratch. Stripe invoices. I'm just adding the pressure to myself to make this work. So 60% confident here. Okay. So, naturally, if I'm used to automations, I would go choose a trigger, and then I would look for a Stripe trigger, right? Unfortunately, Airtable does not integrate with Stripe. So that means that we're kind of caught that we'd either have to like find write a script or something like that. But luckily, there's kind of this new unlock, which is incoming webhooks, right? So when webhook received. So whenever you don't have a native trigger in Airtable, your kind of second reflex should be, is there a webhook? So does the service I'm trying to integrate with have webhooks? So you mentioned Webflow. I'm happy to cover that at the end. There's some limitations there that I'm happy to talk through at the end. There's a reason why I didn't pick Webflow. And I'll contrast it with why I picked Stripe. So it'll be clear in a moment. So let's go ahead with when webhook received, which is when you don't have a native integration. So this first thing you see is that it gives you a URL. So that URL is for, and I'm this explanation is attributable to CJ from Stripe. It's a phone number. So you can essentially give this URL to other services to say, hey, Stripe, when an invoice is created, could you tell this URL that information, right? And then Airtable is going to kind of interpret that just like any other of its native triggers, right? So when you think about when record is created, when a record is created in Airtable and you have that trigger as when record is getting created, it's going to give you like, oh, this is the attachment. That's the status. That's the notes. This is the name. And then you can use those in future steps. Well, when someone calls this URL, when Stripe says, hey, Airtable, you've got a new invoice, it's also going to send all of that information. It's going to send the invoice number, the amount, the taxes, the status. And then Airtable is going to parse it for you so you can use it in future steps. So again, that was the theory of it. Now let's actually go into Stripe and see what that webhooks looks like. So when it calls this phone number, what information does it send? So hopefully, I feel like I'm doing a lot of theory. Let me know in the chat if this is making sense. So essentially, if the tool you're trying to integrate with doesn't natively integrate with Airtable, you can use when webhook is received. And let's kind of go to Stripe and understand how webhooks work in Stripe. So I'm going to go here, going to go to webhooks. So I'm in my Stripe dashboard. I'm going to go to developers, and then I'm going to go to webhooks. I've been testing. Awesome. So David, awesome. I'm curious why. Like, what is it that you want, that you feel like webhooks are a solve for? And I'm happy to integrate that. Hey, Penny, good to see you. Yeah, let's add a webhook here. So webhooks, add endpoint. This is saying, okay, where should Stripe send the information to, right? And then they're asking for our phone number. So endpoint URL is just fancy way of saying give us the phone number for your Airtable application. So I'm copy pasting that. And then it's going to say select events to send. Right. So what is this saying is like, well, what do you want me to send? When do you want me to call you? I'm continuing with this analogy until it doesn't make sense anymore. Do you want me to send you updates to your account, your balance, your billing portal? And there are a lot of webhooks. And this is going to contrast to Webflow. Webflow has two webhooks two events on which it could send information for. The first is when a form is submitted, when any form is submitted, and that's important. And second, when the site is published. Now you can contrast that with Stripe, where you can pretty much anything that happens in Stripe could be its own webhook. In our case, we want invoice. So as I search for that, I have different events, different things that can happen that they can call our phone number for. Created, deleted, finalized, marked uncollectible. So their webhook granularity is, they're extremely granular in what they can send you information for. What I want to start is invoice created. So that's saying, okay, for this phone number, I'm going to call for this one event. You can add multiple, but the way Airtable works, it's actually easier if you have one kind of event. And I'll kind of talk about that later as to why. Okay, so let me add that endpoint. So this is saying, okay, I will call this number when an invoice is created. Now let's go ahead and send the test webhook. So this is saying, let's have a fake conversation. Let me know where this analogy kind of continues. I don't know how far I can keep it, but so event, invoice created. If you have multiple, you can select here, send test webhook. Okay, this is the conversation, I guess, that Airtable and Stripe just had. So they're sharing information, right? So we just had the Stripe called Airtable and said, "Hey, here's some information for you," right? So created some meta information. So the type of event, the data of the invoice that was created. Right, and that's really important for us. So it's saying this was an invoice. This is its ID, the amount paid, the amount that's remaining to be paid, right, amount due. So it's kind of saying all the information around the invoice that was just created. the currency. And as you can see, there's like a lot of fields. So what the customer email is, what the due date, ending balance, all the information you've ever wanted around an invoice is now sent to Airtable. So because we've sent that test, let's see how Airtable interprets the same information. So I'm going to go all about webhooks right here. So run a test. So this is saying, have you had any conversations on this URL, on this phone number? And Airtable, I don't know how, I'm liking this analogy. Let's see how far I can take it. So it said, yes, I did have a conversation. And I asked him, well, what was that conversation about? Well, they're going to reflect that information, right? And it actually structures it for you, right? So it says, okay, well, this is the metadata around the invoice, right? Actually around the webhook itself, not around the invoice. It's saying what environment it happened. Was it live data? And then the invoice is in data object. And then we have all of that same information that we had before, right? So it was an invoice, I owe $1,000, and then customer name and all of this information that's relevant to that invoice. So if we want to update Airtable, let's actually start kind of creating our invoices table. So maybe I want something like a status, right? So let's see if they have a status. Status is draft. Okay, let's keep that, let's have draft as our first status here. Save. I'm going to delete the existing records. And then let me know in the chat, like what information do you want to track? We're not going to track all the hundreds of them. What is important here? So let me know in the chat. I'm just going to kind of say things. Country, maybe. Amount due. I feel like that's good. Amount due should be there. Amount due. It's going to be a currency field. Let's give it into amount. Hey, Matthew. How are you? If you're interested in iOS shortcuts, check out Matthew. He's got a whole community around iOS shortcuts that are awesome. Email, customer name, invoice number, account ID. Awesome. Okay, let's add those in. So email. So it's customer email. It's going to be email field. So ID is really important, right? So that's actually a really good one. Thanks, Penny. So if I ever want to update information around a specific invoice, I need a key between Airtable and Stripe. What I mean by key is a way of saying, well, if we're having the same conversation again, how do I know if that conversation pertains to an existing invoice, right? And so luckily in the object, we have this ID. So I'm going to call this Stripe ID. Oh, awesome. Yeah, okay, we can do that, Matthew, for sure. So these are not for subscriptions, but I know that they have invoices for webhooks for subscriptions as well. So I'm going to call this a single line text. It's going to be a single line text that I'm going to call Stripe ID. There we go. Okay. What else do we have here? Invoice number. I have that. Customer name, email, account ID. I'm going to keep it to invoice ID and keep email as the identifier for the user. Okay. There's a lot here. Okay. So now let's actually go ahead. Okay, so now that we have the webhook, we've received the phone number, the call from Stripe with the information. Let's go ahead and create a record. Right? So we're saying when that conversation happens, we want to track this part of that conversation. So let me delete some stuff here. Right? Notes, attachments. Yeah, I don't need attachments. Status. And the name, we're going to make this a, maybe there's a date. Maybe we want a date. Just so we can have like the date of the invoice when it was sent. Let's see if there's a date. Creation date. They have a created. I don't know what this is in terms of date. Oh, actually, I can just create it time. I'll just have a invoice date is going to be created time. We can do that in Airtable. Boom. Okay. So now we want to go ahead and create this record. So status, we know that this is a new one, so it's going to be a draft. So what I don't need to take I know that by the creation of this record, I'm going to go ahead and have a status of draft. So I can just update draft, and then we just go field by field. Amount due. I'm filling in the information from the webhook that's been parsed, right? So I'm going in, and then I'm going into data. I know it's not like super clear. Maybe I'll zoom in. Is that better? Like that? I want to go into, and then I can search. Can I search? I think I can search. I want amount due, insert. Next, I want customer email. Can I just, no, I've got to be at the right level. So I can't search the whole tree. So I got to go into data, object, and then here, email, insert, Stripe ID, super important. Continue, body, we're just going to do this one more time here. And then data, object, and what I want is ID. Okay, let me test this out, run test. Boom. Okay, let me zoom out. It's just for my sanity here. There we go. So David with Gumroad, I check if Gumroad has webhooks. If it does, you shouldn't have a problem doing the same thing. So now I have status is draft, amount due is 1,000, customer email. Now note that this might be in pennies on Stripe. So if someone could check the documentation whether Stripe sends in pennies, but that's something you could actually edit quite easily. Just create a pennies field and then make a formula field that is pennies divided by 100. So customer email Stripe. Okay, great. We're everything done. Let's turn this on, right? So when webhook is received, it's going to go ahead and create a record. So let's go ahead and test this out. Actually, one last thing I want to do is make my primary field a little more informative. Formula. So I'm going to call this invoice. Maybe we do something like customer email and Stripe ID? I don't know. That feels right. There we go. Okay. Boom. Boom. Boom, boom, boom. Okay. I was zoned out there. Okay. So let's actually test this out. Let's actually go ahead and in Stripe, create a new invoice, right? So what this is telling us is that this is live, right? So it's saying whenever a new invoice is created, it's going to go ahead and send a webhook for this specific, that specific invoice. So let's go into customers, invoices, create invoice, and let's go Matt at, oh man, I have to write your last name here. Matthew Casanelli at .com. I think that might be it. Matthew, let's see. You might get an invoice. Add. I'm adding you as a customer. See. Add customer. There you go. Boom. I'm test item. I'm giving you one of them. 50. Charging you $50. I don't know what for. Okay. Let's send test invoice. Right, so this should, oh no, shit, I haven't activated my account. So Matthew, I'm getting this one. That's okay, send test invoice. Okay, so that should, if we see here, right, so it should have created a webhook, and I see it right here, it's already done. Okay, and I think because it's a test, it's not giving us the amount due, so I'm just going to update that, right? Or I said $50. So just because it's a test. Or actually, we can go check. We can go check what happened there. So we have our invoices automatically updated. So let's actually go into run history. Let's see what happened there. Let's go into the body. Let's go into the data object, right? So the amount due was 0. And I think that's just because we're in we're in testing, so it doesn't actually give you the real amount. But otherwise, all of the information is correct. So I think once you get out of testing, it'll give you the right amount. Okay, so we've created our Stripe invoice. So that was actually step one, right? And hopefully, let me know, Carrie, if you feel at least more confident using webhooks. We're actually going to integrate a second one in just a moment, a little more complex here. But that's actually, if you're familiar with Zapier triggers, this is actually not that different. The only difference is that you need to find in the application you're trying to integrate with where webhooks need to be created and then insert the URL you want to send to so that you get the information in Airtable, which will parse it for you, and then you could use it in future steps. Okay, so that was step one. Let's go into apps. We can mark this as done. Okay, now remember that part of the different events or the things we could track in Stripe, or things that happen in Stripe that could be sent via webhook, another was invoice updated. So let's go ahead and see whether we could, when one of these is updated, maybe it's been paid, or Matthew doesn't want to pay us and it's uncollectible, could we update this status to always match the status? So if we go to invoices, there's this concept of status, right? So this one's open. So it went from draft to open because it was sent. Could we have these always match the same status? So this is where I'm feeling a tiny bit less confident in Stripe, but I think we can do it. So let me know if you're still with me. Let's do this. Okay. So same process, right? We're going to go back into developers. We're going to create a separate webhook. And the reason I think I want to create a separate webhook is that it might not send the same information. It might not be parsed the same information. And so in Airtable, I think it's quite easier to have separate flows, separate automations for separate events. But I think you may be able to parse them in one. But listen, I don't think Stripe's going to limit the number of webhooks you create, right? So let's play it safe and create a new webhook. Okay, so Stripe invoice. So let's call this new automation Stripe invoice update. So again, we don't see any Stripe triggers. It's going to give us a different URL. Let me actually give a little more space here. There we go. That's actually nicer. Let's go here. Same thing. And then events to send. So I'm going to go invoice. Let's go invoice updated. And let's actually check what is invoice updated. Invoice updated Stripe. Okay, invoice items update. Okay, so it's going to send you that same information. So this is actually how to update. This is actually the post call. So this is actually how to update a. So I'm going to go webhook. Okay, so I guess it is in pennies. So we can make that. We can update that after. So updated. So yeah, I can check it here. Invoice updated. There we go. Invoice.updated is an invoice. Okay, this is more confusing than I think it needs to be. Let's actually just run it. Let's test it. Let's see what happens when we test the webhook. I think that's easier. So we've put the URL. Let's add the endpoint. Let's send a test webhook. Invoice updated. Send test webhook. Okay. So it's giving us the type, right? So it's saying that this is an updated invoice, and it's got data, object, the ID. So we need to actually see if the ID matches an existing invoice in our account, right? And then it gives you all of the information around that invoice. So it's not only sending you the things that have updated. So it doesn't tell you here are the subset of information that were updated. And let's see. It has data, right? That same information as before. Next time it's gonna information. It has previous attributes, right? So this is things that were there before that I guess were either not there or changed. So let's see if they have a status. Okay, we have draft. Okay, great. So what we want is to catch this webhook and then update the status. So let's just configure it. Here there are no changes as an example, right? Because this is just a test webhook, but at least we can integrate it with this test one. And then we're gonna be able to use it with the live invoice. So let me know if that makes sense. I know it's a little confusing here. So I've done that. Let me go ahead, send a test webhook. Oh, I've already done that. Okay, so let's go here. So let's run the test. Let's see if it's received anything. And essentially the difference here is that we have the information, but we want to go ahead. Okay, if there are two things in data now versus one. Before there was just object, now there's object and previous attributes. So let's go ahead and find this ID, right? So we have it here. So if I go into ID, I should always find one record in Airtable that matches the ID that I'm currently updating, right? So right here, Stripe ID, so that works. So let's go ahead and as a next step, how do we find this one, this record right here, so that we can update it? Now, luckily in Airtable, there's an action called find records. So it's going to go ahead and find all the records that match this one trigger. Now, we know that it's always going to find at most one, right? So go into Stripe invoices. What we want is a condition. So what record should it find? So give me all records where Stripe ID contains, and then here you can change this to dynamic. So instead of having a static value, something like give me every status that is drafting or draft. Instead, let's go give me every status, not status, give me every Stripe ID, should call that Stripe invoice ID, it should be is, let's make this dynamic, go from step one, go into the webhook, data, object, and then insert the ID. Okay, now if I run this test, I should see this one record. Okay, it says that it did find one record, this one right here, right? This first one, so that's great, that's what we expected. So now we want to go ahead and update that record with the changes that we want to keep track of. Now, if you expect that your customer email might change, that your amount due might change, your Stripe ID can't change, but your invoice date, actually invoice date is a computed field. But what we want to keep track of is just the status. But really you can keep track of whatever you want. Now, be careful here. You really have to make sure that it only finds one record, right? If it finds multiple records, you might hit a little bit of an issue. And if it does find multiple records, well, that's probably because you haven't set the automation up properly. Okay, so let's go ahead and update the record, right? So we're updating the record with the changes. I'm gonna go to Stripe invoices. And here it asks for record ID. So which record should it update? But luckily we can pull in the record. Oh wait, I have two fields that are missing configuration? No, it should be good. Test again. Oh, okay, it's because it's this one, because I haven't configured these actions. Okay, good. Okay, go from step 2, go to the records that you find, and then make a new list of record ID. So again, I'm going to zoom in here. So I went into step 2. I went to the records that I found. And this is kind of like, you can almost think of it as an array. You can send it as a list or a grid if you're sending an email. But really, and then length if you want to know how many it's found. But really what we want is a list of record IDs. So inserting that, let me zoom back out. And the field that we want to update is status. So let's go ahead and find records. No, we want to go to step 1. Sorry, let's zoom in again. Go to body and then input the status. So go to data, Sorry, I can't like get it out of this like bottom right. And we want status. So insert the name of the status, right? This is not going to change anything. So maybe, well, actually I can make it. So let's say it's open. I could update this to open, and then I could run the test, and it should update to draft. There we go. Oh, very important. Let me delete this because the API looks at the capitalization. So I'm going to make sure that it matches the same capitalization as Stripe. So just going to update that, and this is probably open, something like that. Save. Let me make this open, and then let me change this to open. Test again, and it updates to draft, right? So now we've taken our test Stripe invoice and updated the value to draft based on a webhook. Okay, whew. We're covering a lot of ground here. So now we know that when things update in Stripe, those changes for the status at least to have status. So Matthew, your question is, can you format the API data to match the record instead? So you mean if we wanted this to have draft as a capital D, or that, you know, maybe we have a different mapping of statuses and you'd like to be able to match that, the single select? So let me know if that's your question, and I'll answer it in a moment in the affirmative, but it'll require a little bit of elbow grease with some scripting that I'm yeah, Colleen, we can actually, so I'm not sure, that's a good question. I guess it will create a new status, and I actually think that's like a really good hack. I'm not sure what all the possibility of statuses are in Stripe, and so I was actually gonna just fake it and just keep running, and then that the single select will auto-populate, and I do think that's a good practice, but I think as Matthew, maybe you wanna have a mapping from Stripe to Airtable. So let's close this one out, and then I'll write a quick script where you could potentially create a mapping, right? Okay. Hey Pierre, good to see you. How are you? Okay, great. So let's turn this on. And so what this means is that I have two webhooks right now. One when an invoice is created, which we've already tested out and it works, and one when the record invoice is updated. So let's go back and let's go into invoices. I have this one, which is open. Okay. And then let's see what we could, let's pay this invoice for Matthew. Payment page. Okay, let's pay it. And I don't know if this is going to work. Let's see if what we hope is that the status of this invoice becomes paid in Airtable. So I'm paying. It's been paid. You're welcome, Matthew. Okay. So if I refresh this, this is updated to paid, and we have that status updated to paid. All right. We could see it in a few ways, right? We see that it sent the webhook. So if I go to that webhook, usually we do like, we can do success. I feel like this is a success moment, right? I don't think I have the confetti. Oh no, we're on YouTube. Okay, folks, next week, confetti will be back. So usually we have confetti come down, but just write all caps confetti in the chat, right? So everyone just write confetti, all caps in the chat, and that's gonna be our confetti for this week. But let's figure out, this is one of the bad things about switching to YouTube. I don't know, we'll get the confetti back. We'll definitely get the confetti back. There you go. Thanks, Colleen. I appreciate it. We'll get it back. We'll get the confetti back next week. Where was I? No, we gotta get the confetti back. Yeah, just all caps confetti in the chat. It's not the same. It's not the same. I appreciate it, guys. I appreciate it. I'll get it fixed for next week. Okay. So, right. So we now updated the status, right? And as Colleen mentioned, you can see that it creates those options, right? I appreciate it. Thanks, Eunice. Thanks, Summit. We'll be back next week with proper confetti and the blowhorn. I do miss it. If Joseph's watching, I apologize. Okay, so we have the single selects, and what's good about this is that every time maybe there's a uncollectible or past due and the invoice will update, it'll actually update the single select as well. Now what you can do is you can have a Kanban view, so invoices by status done, right? Now, updates in Airtable are not reflected in Stripe. That's actually something we could do on a future stream if there's interest. I don't see why you would want to, though. Like, is someone paying you in cash, right? And you're like, oh, it's been paid, like with bags of money. So maybe it's not worth doing that two-way sync. Like, all of your updates should happen in Stripe and should be reflected in Airtable. But I do want to, there was a good question from Matthew around, well, what if the webhook doesn't have the format that we need it to have, right? And that's a really good question. So what you can actually do, so let's imagine, I'm going to see if I can do this live. I have absolutely no promises that I could do this. So let's say that my status for paid should be capital paid exclamation mark, which is not what we receive from Stripe, right? So I can write a quick script that takes as input, so status, right, the body, and then takes the data object status, right? So it's going to be called Stripe status. And then I could call, so I would need let, so it's input config, something like that, input. Right, okay, let input config equal input.config. And then let me just console.log input config. So we're getting into scripting here. I'm going full steam here. And the reason we're using a script is that there's no logic in Airtable. So none of the steps could say like, oh, create a mapping of what the invoice status is from Stripe to what it should be in Airtable. But you have this kind of escape valve with scripting that you can pretty much do anything. And I think this one should be relatively simple. So what we hope is that it outputs, right, so it has Stripe status. So we can say if, you can probably do case, but I'll just do if. If Stripe status equal, I think, draft, else. So we're gonna let Airtable status equal draft, like that, right? So we find that the caps is important. Oh, so it should be config.stripe status. Does that work? Yeah, that's fine for now. Else, we're gonna say let Airtable status equal config.stripe status. Yeah. So essentially, like, you can just create a case, right? So whatever information comes into your webhook, You can adapt it in a very simple script so that it outputs the way you want to. And it's actually like a really good segue into what I wanted to show you after, which is, well, what if you want to run an API call based off of the webhook, right? So I'll show you that in a moment, and I think this is like a good primer for it. We've got 10 minutes here. So config.stripe status. So why doesn't it like, oh. Oh, input config. Whoops. There we go. Okay, and then, so here, if I console.log Airtable status, why isn't it like this? I think that should be fine. Let me see if this works. So, test. Fingers crossed here, folks. Oh, you're right. Input config dot stripe status. No, this should work. Is it triple equal? Let me just say let Airtable status equal test. Right, and then Airtable. Maybe just because I'm declaring it there. Let's try that. That seems to be working. So this is the only way. The only way to change the casing is actually here, right? So Matthew, your question was like spot on, because there is no way to adapt. There is no like formatting or ifs or any kind of logic you can put into the script that's into Airtable Automations itself. You have to go by a script. So I'm not sure why this is not working. Stripe status input config. Maybe my computer is just a little slow, but this is running on Airtable server, so I'm not sure. Pierre, I don't think that should make a difference, the stripe status. This is going to time out, so maybe it is double equal. I mean, the script text formatting option is just by writing custom code, right? So you would have to be running custom code to do that editing. So I'm not sure why this is edit code. Okay, I think I've broken it, but that's okay. That's okay. This is the only option. I hope I didn't break anything here. Oh, it's maybe because, let me see here. Let me just do one more time. There we go. Okay, it worked. Woo! Confetti! So it outputs draft, but what I said was paid with an exclamation mark. So if is paid, output paid with an exclamation mark. Otherwise, output the stripe status. You're gonna have to trust me that this works. You can also format. Yeah, I guess. So here, so Pierre has a good note where could you potentially have a field that has lower case, but you wouldn't be able to format it into a single select, right? So what I recommend is that whenever you're trying to do something in Airtable Automations that has no action for it, right? So when I say action, it's something like, can you format the text? Can we run an API call? Could we do an if this then that, right? So like a logic tree, you have to use scripting, right? So today, the only things you can do as an action is update information elsewhere. There is no logic today. There is no way to format or do things like that. So really the only escape valve there, the only option is to write a script. Writing scripts feels much more intimidating than it actually is. So if someone could drop I have a 4-part series on learning how to write scripts in Airtable. And honestly, that's how I learned. Yeah, that's a good point, Courtney. You're right that you could have 2 automations here. You could, I don't know if that's better, but if you are gung-ho on this, you could have a switch formula that in if this, right? So you would get the status, and then based off of the formula, you would run a second automation in that updates the single select to the right, to the output of the switch formula. I don't know if that's better. I feel like writing a short script, it gives you like cred, but okay. So that's what, it is a good worker. You're totally right. Okay. So let's, right. So Colleen just dropped the playlist. Appreciate that. So if you are interested in learning how to write Airtable scripts, check that out. 4-part series. And honestly, that's where I learned. I'm not super proficient at it, but I do want to show you one last thing around one more flow, what I'll just walk through. So let me just hide my screen here for a sec, if I can. Okay, let me just go into my, okay. All right, so the next flow I want to show you as an example of what else you can do with webhooks is, so in this base, I have the sign up to everyone who signs up to my website. So here, this is a Memberstack integration. So when someone signs up to the Essential Guide to Airtable, you drop your email and you say whether you want to sign up to the newsletter. My newsletter lives in Revue, and all emails go to a thing called Mailerlite, right? So every sign up goes to Mailerlite. Those that want the newsletter go to Revue. So I needed to create this flow that says, okay, well, does this person already exist in my database, in my Airtable base? Second, do they want to sign up to the newsletter? Third, send them to Mailerlite whether or not they want to sign up to my newsletter. And luckily, this is why I paid for Zapier. So it was like an 8-step flow, and but Memberstack luckily has webhooks. So I have them right here. So I have this new trigger. So whenever a new member is created, it sends a webhook to Airtable. So let me walk you through the flow. So it receives that webhook, but then there was all this other things that needed to happen. I need to send it to Revue. I needed to send it to Mailerlite. So let me just again like walk you through what this script does. So first, it formats the what I get from Memberstack. It gets their email. It gets whether or not they want to be a member of the newsletter and their ID. So I can create a record. So I wanted to create the record in the script itself, because there was no, like, I didn't, depending on whether there was a newsletter or not, if there wasn't, it would break the automation. So from there, I checked whether it was an existing or a new member. And then I just called Mailerlite, right? So I directly called Mailerlite to create this user, this new person in Mailerlite. And then I checked whether they wanted to sign up to the newsletter. Let me make this a little larger. And if they did, I send that information over to Revue. So, once you have webhooks and APIs, you know how to write a post and a call and understand webhooks. There's really very few flows you can't automate within Airtable, right? So this was, maybe 79 lines of code. If you're good at writing scripts, it'll probably be 20, 25. And, as a 2-step flow, it just goes from webhook received, runs a simple script, and it does all that work for me. So I do really encourage you to kind of see webhooks as an unlock. So whenever you can't integrate directly with a tool, you can use webhooks. So I want to make sure I covered every were there any, does anyone interested in Webflow? So should I do just a quick mention on why Webflow it's a little difficult? So I'm just going through the chat. Okay, it seems like I covered most of it. Okay, let's do 2 minutes on Webflow, and then I'll let you guys go, and appreciate y'all joining. So Webflow, the challenge with Webflow. Okay, we've got Kish, Felix, Webflow. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's go to my Webflow. So let's say I have 2 forms. All right. Everyone's been waiting for Webflow. I made y'all wait till the end, right? Appreciate your patience. Okay. So let's imagine I have 2 forms. I've got where is it? So forms, my form submissions. Okay, so I've got name, email, company, phone number, address. These are 2 separate forms. Now the challenge in Webflow, if I go into integrations and I create a webhook, it's gonna trigger on all form submissions, right? So it's like a one webhook on all forms, and the challenge there, and this might be an Airtable limitation as well. So let me just walk you through what's happening here. So Webflow form submission, choose a trigger, and then when webhook received, and I copy. So let's go ahead and submit a form. Where is that? So it seems like people have already kind of faced this challenge of one webhook for all forms, which makes it a little bit of a pain. So let's say I go Aron, my email address like that, and I submit that. That's not a problem, right? I get that information in Airtable, and then I see name and email, right? It also gives you the form name. Now the challenge here is, let's say I wanted to create a record. Well, it's gonna work. Actually, there might be a solution here. So let's say I wanna create a new user. I'm just gonna put the email from step 1. Data, sorry, I can't see here. Data, email. Okay, so this will work, right? I can turn this on, I can test this, and then users, I have their email. Now, a challenge is if I submit another form, go automate AATT, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, Zen Summit, I don't know, there we go. It's gonna send a different webhook. So if I test this, it's gonna break this part because it can't find email. Now, I think the only way around this, right, is to just have one automation that is, for when things match the first form submission, right? So you run one automation for this one, and then a separate one for this. This one's gonna fail every time you submit this form, and this one's gonna fail every time you submit that form. Yeah, so Eunice, great question. So I'll end there, and I was gonna not trick. I didn't want to cover it. So the challenge there. So let's say you wanted to write a script, right? So let's write a script that says, oh, okay, well, let's just filter if as an input variable, right? Let's go. We want from step 1, we want the form name. Right, so if it's an email form, so form name. So if form name, I got to do the whole input config, but I'm going to tell you why it doesn't work. I would need at a certain point to output what I want the record to be, right? So here, for instance, I create the record in the script, right? And this comes from the webhook. However, because we can't just say, hey, put the whole data in, right? Just put the whole body. I actually have to input the field itself, right? So if I put name, half of the time name is not going to exist and it's going to crash this script, I think, right? So that's the issue, right? So I can't put input name because I don't have it half the time. And I can't just go, okay, just input the body, right? So I can't go down. I don't think so. I don't think there's a wild card. But there's two things I'll as homework for everyone before next week and for myself is one, could you have one automation that fails every time another form is submitted, right? So it just says, hey, the webhook, I didn't see the information I needed and it failed. And then second, what happens if there's no input, but it's not used in the script, right? So if in the script, I don't actually use the input, will that break the script? I'll leave it up to you guys. Maybe I'll come back to y'all next week with an answer. I'm going to try it. This is why I didn't want to do Webflow because it is a little tricky, but I think we have two paths of solution. So yeah, we're 1 hour past. I appreciate all of you guys, all of y'all joining. This was huge fun. Next week, I'm going to be on with, let me check. I'm going to be on with Jacob. We're going to build a Discord bot with autocode. Yeah, you can't really put in dummy. Could I put? No, I don't think so. It's a good question. Sorry, I'm like back on this. I'm a little, could I put dummy data? I guess I could. No, it has to be from step one or else it won't work. All right. So with that, appreciate y'all joining. We'll be back next week with Jacob and building a Discord bot. We're going to be writing some custom code. So again, if you're a little intimidated by code, autocode makes it really, really easy. And let me know in the chat if you are more confident using webhooks. So Carrie, I know that you felt intimidated. I'd love to know if you feel intimidated still. Penny, let me know. Jeremy, thanks for joining. Eunice, Pierre, appreciate. I'll meet you back all same time next week. We'll be doing webhooks as well. We can do webhooks in autocode. Yeah, thanks Courtney. Appreciate. Thanks Summit for coming. Really appreciate. Colleen, more confident always. Appreciate that. Great to hear. And Felix as well. Appreciate that. Cool. Okay. I'll let you guys go. Do make sure to subscribe to the channel. You get a notification every time I'm live. And I will see you all next week, same time, same place, with more confetti and confetti that works in the stream. Bye, y'all. Have a great day.